Welcome, everyone. We're so grateful for your attendance here today with us at our ECI webinar. Um, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this series with you all, and we're really excited about today's presentation with our session leaders. My name is Aaron Cobb, and I'm Senior Scholar of Character for the Educating Character Initiative. And it's my privilege to host this webinar, which is focused this semester on character for, with, and in community. I'd like to start with a few announcements. So the first thing is just to encourage you to join the ECI community if you haven't done so already. If you're already a member of the ECI community, please invite your colleagues. There's lots of stuff happening at the initiative. This is a way to keep connected with us and to learn about opportunities for learning, for webinars, for workshops, for all sorts of things, to hear about the good work that's happening across the ECI community. So please join us. Second, if you haven't yet registered for future sessions in our webinar series, please be sure to register. Next month, we'll be hearing from Angel Parham at University of Virginia about community engaged learning and service learning. So we're excited for that session. Please sign up for that as well. And then please consider joining our first book club of the fall semester. Later this month, we'll be talking with Karen Storr about her book, Minding the Gap, Moral Ideals and Moral Improvement. And then in October, we'll be talking with Kate Denial about her book, A Pedagogy of Kindness. Both of these sessions will feature interviews and conversations with the authors, and these are opportunities to engage with them about their work. Let's jump straight into this webinar's material. Today's session is focused on our series titled Character for, with, and in Community. And our aim in this webinar is to help equip you and your colleagues for good work on your campuses so that you can take concrete steps toward becoming communities of character, shaping your faculty, staff, and students for character and for wholeness. Today's session features an interdisciplinary team who are thinking in contextualized ways about character formation. So I'll introduce you to our panelists, and then I'll turn our conversation over to them. Janae Nilsson is an assistant professor of psychology at Brigham Young University. She earned her PhD in psychology from BYU and then held postdoctoral research fellowships at Baylor University and at Harvard Medical School. Her expertise lies in the cultivation of character traits such as gratitude and compassion, and the positive impacts of religion and spirituality on youth development. Anne Jeffrey is associate professor of philosophy at Baylor University. She earned her PhD from Georgetown University, served as a postdoctoral research fellow for the Hope and Optimism Project at the University of Notre Dame, and then served as a faculty member at the University of South Alabama before joining Baylor. Her forthcoming monograph, Being and Becoming Good, on the diversity of human goodness and virtue, develops and defends an inclusive, pluralist version of Aristotelian naturalism and virtue theory. Finally, Sarah Schnittker is professor of psychology and neuroscience at Baylor University. She earned her PhD in California on the role of the founder and director of the Baylor Research and Growth and Human Thriving Science Center. Janae, Ann, and Sarah will present for between 25 and 30 minutes, after which we'll have an opportunity for questions and conversations. You're welcome to post questions in the chat. I'll do my best to bring these forward. Janae, Ann, and Sarah, I'll turn the session over to you to lead. Welcome. We're excited to learn from you.
Thank you. I'm going to be throughout the presentation just asking Anne to go forward on the slides because she is handling the slides for me. So don't be distracted by that. And if you can go ahead and go to my slide, Anne, thank you. So anytime I get the privilege and honor of talking about my Anishinaabe heritage, I always like to begin and start off, not just because this is something that we do culturally, but also because I feel like it is a good way to honor my family. So first, I will tell you a little bit about my tribe. So my tribe is the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa from Minnesota. You can see the map here where we're located. We're a woodland tribe. which is a little bit different from what a lot of people think about. So we have very unique customs, culture that's specific to the land in Minnesota and that woodland area. But my most important thing that I like to highlight is my grandpa here. This is my grandpa who's Native American, and he's now passed away. But anytime I get the privilege of talking about my heritage, I like to dedicate it to my grandpa. My grandpa was a hero and a father figure to me. And I'm really grateful that I get to share a little bit about our heritage and culture with you today. So a lot of people who Indigenous people who do work in academia and in any type of sphere will oftentimes talk about how much Indigenous they are, which is kind of unique because a lot of like people who are Irish, for example, don't need to tell how much they are. So, but this is something that we do. So I am a quarter Native American, quarter this boys band Chippewa. But one thing that I like to really emphasize is that I'm 100% human. And so that's how I would really like to frame the work that we do today, the work that we share with you today. That we all have that in common. We all bring our diverse perspectives, our families, our heritages, but we are all 100% human, and that's where we can have common ground.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sarah Schnicker. Um, I do not come from an Indigenous background, and so I wanted to just share a little bit of how I came to this project and the perspective I bring to it. Um, I grew up in a devoutly religious home, evangelical Christianity, and today I'm Episcopalian, and my faith practice is really an essential component of my life. But early in my research career as scientist, I run the Science of Virtue Labs at Baylor. Um, I noticed that much of the discourse and on character education had started to marginalize any consideration of spirituality or transcendence. And I think this has occurred motivated really from a good place of wanting to find a way to talk about character development in a secular, humanist, pluralistic society and not create a way of viewing character development that excludes people. But I think what happened is that we see that there was no discussion of people's deeper meaning systems, what they hold most sacred to them, and what's transcendent. And so in my work, what I've really sought to do is to look at the diverse meaning systems that undergird virtue formation, not only from my own tradition of Christianity, but also looking at Islam, at Indigenous perspectives here with this Anishinaabe project, and really trying to highlight the importance of that meaning system and how to help students integrate their own meaning system in their virtue development context. That's a quick view of me. Anne.
Thanks. I'm Jeffrey. I am, as Erin mentioned, I'm a philosopher by training. I also grew up in a home where Christianity was taught in Miami, which is a multicultural city. And that definitely shaped who I am and how I view sort of the importance of pluralism and what we'll talk about later, contextualism. My current spiritual practice is Episcopalian, still in that Christian tradition, but a form of spirituality that I feel like is open to other religions and worldviews as holding really important truth for us and guidance on the good path to flourishing. So that's important to me. And comes out in a lot of my work. I do some philosophy of religion, and some of my work in ethics is related to how different religious views are influencing the way we think about different moral phenomena. My first book was called God and Morality, and sort of explored those themes. And then I just wrote a book called Being and Becoming Good, which will come out this year. And there I was really interested in how to push on different methods and models for thinking about human flourishing and character strengths or virtues. Noticing places where a lot of the sort of standard or ascendant models in Anglophone academic discussions would center a certain type of very economically privileged or affluent white male as the kind of embodied self you needed to be in order to flourish. And so pushing back on that concept and trying to learn a little bit more from other cultures and also from the social sciences, where we have lots of evidence that people of all sorts flourish, and thinking about what people from various cultures, traditions, embodiment have to teach us about flourishing and virtue, and kind of retooling our accounts of that from a philosophical perspective. And then I've done some interdisciplinary work that has really impacted the way that I do philosophy, work with psychologists. So my first experience in community engaged research was creating the Empowered program with Dr. Kristen Mahari and Dr. Joe Currier and Miss Marie Chastain in Alabama at the time. You can see a little poster here that our adolescents came up with about self-compassion. And there we were trying to think about what are the virtues that are important for this community and how can we encourage them to develop those in context.
Well, today we are going to be talking about a contextual approach to character development. And if we could go back one more slide, Anne, that would be great. Thanks. When we look at character education and the practice of character education, as well as research on it, we see that people are often falling into one of two traps. On the one hand, there are kind of universalism approaches that folks might take, where they say, these are the 6 virtues, or these are the 24 character strengths that are universal around the world. All humans should cultivate them. This is what we should all be targeting when we're trying to develop character in college students. And this is problematic because it does not attend to the diversity of our contexts and how different meaning systems value different things in terms of one's moral character. I remember encountering this a bit as a first-year grad student when I was reading through the Values in Action Inventory of Strengths handbook that Chris Peterson and Martin Seligman put out, which was a phenomenal piece that was really instigating a whole field of study around character. And yet I noticed, hey, they seem to have a universal list here, but they've forgotten the virtue of patience, which I think really reflected the kind of Western secular approach, whereas that is a virtue that is heavily emphasized in Islam and Eastern religions. And so on the other side, though, we also see people moving to a relativism, which says, well, there's no set of good habits for flourishing for all humans, that any culture, even any individual, should just choose what kind of character she values. And this becomes problematic because it ignores that there are indeed species typical characteristics of human beings, and that we do see recurrent patterns in what is considered morally good and valuable that pops up across cultures, but there is variation as well. And I even think we see some of this in other species. So for example, several species of primates have norms of fairness and that they demonstrate anger or other kind of emotions when those are violated. So there are norms of fairness across all human cultures. They might differ what exactly those are, but we see that recurs. And so what we propose is taking a contextualism approach, and that's the approach we've tried to take today with some of the work we're presenting. And instead of trying to speak specifically about this is the human universal, or this is, we just can't do anything like that, it says it allows for universals in human behavior, cognition, and development, rooted in our evolutionary past and in our neurological development. But a contextualized approach says all these universals are always shaped by culture in a bidirectional way. And so instead of trying to ask what are good habits all people should be cultivating, it says in this particular context, what habits lead to flourishing for individuals here in this time and place? And what moral habits should we be cultivating specifically in our universities for our students? And so today we're going to use Anishinaabe principles of relationality, process, and reciprocity to really disrupt the hidden assumptions in character education and psychology that we see in a lot of the research and practice. But I want us to go into this not looking to say, oh, we all need to adopt an Anishinaabe practice. That is not the point. It's to illustrate what this might look like, and then to all be thinking about our own universities and the cultures that we have there, each unique to our context, and think about what they might say about character development, as well as recognizing that our students come from many different particular contexts and backgrounds. Some of our students are religious, some are not. Some are Indigenous, some are not. And so recognizing each university has its own culture and context, but then also recognizing our students bring a context with them. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Janae, a few more pitfalls we want to avoid.
So just to recap, we want to try to avoid universalism and relativism, and we also want to be really careful that we are avoiding appropriation. So we talk at length about what that means and how we think we can do that well in the paper we've written, Anishinaabe Principles, and I'm assuming that will be made available to you all. But just kind of we want to take an approach with Anishinaabe knowledge that is one of learning, one of humility, one of appreciation. And we also want to, instead of now making these Anishinaabe principles a template, which we will then force onto a wrong context, which is not what we want to do. We want to think, what are ways that these principles can make us, as Sarah said so well, can make us rethink or disrupt some of the assumptions that we already have. So is there something that we can glean from this? And then are there principles existing within the character education world or within psychology or within our various disciplines that are analogs to these principles? And how can these principles improve our character education as we are doing them now?
Yeah, so I'm gonna just start by engaging in a bit of storytelling and contextualizing to talk about something that happened when I first came to this work. So Janae was working as a postdoc in the Science and Virtues Lab, and I was sort of a scholar in residence as an outsider philosopher. And Janae invited me to join her in this project, honoring her heritage and her family. And I truthfully knew next to nothing about the Anishinaabe people. I did not know anything about this philosophy. I was trained in a program that did not pay attention to that. And so I began to read, and I read a story that was really riveting to me and did this sort of disruption work in me. So I wanted to share that story and then kind of what it brought up for me. Because storytelling and story work is really important in the Anishinaabe tradition. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But I'm just going to kind of enact a little bit of story work here. So in the 1960s, some non-native researchers and like settler farmers in Minnesota began asking the Minnesota government and the state legislature to fund research on wild rice. And specifically, what the historical documents show is that they were asking for the legislature to take the to fund a center where they could figure out like the genetic code of the rice and domesticate it. So they wanted to be able to produce more. One of these documents, and this is a little bit upsetting, but one of the documents in these letters says that the Anishinaabe should use his heritage, take the one natural resource that is uniquely his and not waste it. There's so much upsetting in that statement, but the legislature did fund the research, and they started a breeding program at the University of Minnesota. It actually has continued to be funded. Like in 2016, Minnesota created a new faculty line for a faculty breeder at the University of Minnesota. And this happened despite the fact that Anishinaabe peoples continued to request that this research be stopped. The scientists were arguing that the wild rice was in essence a kind of genetic sequence and some cellular material, and they wanted to enhance it genetically and domesticate it, and they thought no one has intellectual property rights over this. And that's how they were thinking about the essence of the wild rice. And the Anishinaabe people did not try to assert intellectual property rights in their legal battle and their battle on the ground to stop this research and activity. Instead, they just refused the idea that what the wild rice was reducible to some sort of DNA sequence and cellular matter. They said that the researchers and the farmers had misunderstood what wild rice was in its essence. And instead, they conceived of wild rice as something that was defined through its relation to the lakes where it was harvested, the rituals that people engaged in to harvest by taking trips of 2 or 3 people by canoe, using a long stick or a winnower to shake the plants and to gather the rice from the lake, and then the dances and other rituals they would use to prepare it and how they would offer it up as a sacred gift of food. So they said, you're not using the same thing. You're calling it wild rice, but that's not what it is anymore when you domesticate it. And when I read this, it sort of blew my mind as a person who is trained in analytic philosophy, where we like to think about definitions of objects and beings according to their essence. And this has to do with like what it is in itself with respect to nothing else. We talk about like intrinsic qualities and intrinsic properties of things as defining what the things are, and extrinsic qualities, things that have to do with like its relations to other beings, can't be definitive. And so I realized in that moment that I had a lot of assumptions about what things are essentially, that I bring to my life and to my work. So I think that this story, and then the story of my kind of encountering this, illustrates that one way we might be thinking about human selves and our character is not as these isolated individuals where we're trying to figure out what people's traits are isolated from their contexts and their relationships. Who are they really? And that question sort of presumes that things are defined by some essence that is non-relational. And that kind of goes on as an unquestioned assumption in a lot of these contexts, whether it's in psychology or philosophy of character. And so what I actually started to do in my own teaching on character and ethics was to do engaged learning, where I just kind of decided we're not going to teach these principles in abstraction. We're going to teach ethics about these people or this place in Waco. And what goes on in the classroom where we're trying to abstract away from that is like always going to occur with some loss if what things really are is defined by their relation and their context and their environment. And I'm happy to talk more about some of this engaged learning and character education in the Q&A. But something that we can think about as a sort of prompt as we're going out from the seminar later is, who are the communities and what are the beings and environments that have shaped who you are, and that might be actually part of your essence and yourself. But maybe some things about our culture tell us to isolate those as extrinsic or external to us and not part of the deep self. What might they be and how have they shaped you?
Thank you, Anne. Love that story. Our second principle I want to talk about, added on top of that layer of relationality, is this idea of process. And that we take an Anishinaabe view of character development, it really must focus on the process rather than outcome or product. One of the things I was really surprised to learn when I entered into this project is that Anishinaabe, Janae, can you say the word correctly, please?
Anishinaabe. See, I can't even do it. There
See, you
you go.
can't do it. Okay, that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
That it's a verb-based language. That most of the words are going to be verbs rather than nouns, as is with English. And so when we think about character development, it's not going to be, I am honest, but I am speaking honestly. So it's about the doing rather than the having or possessing of a quality or trait. And I know in my lab, we like to talk about, let's not just talk about well-being, but well-doing. What are people actually doing in the world? And that really needs to be part of our understanding of character, that this is about the process, not a static state. And I think, especially when we're talking about college students, this is a time of immense growth and change. And so it's entering in just at one tiny moment in this person's character development trajectory, rather than achieving something, or saying they have it or don't. I think one of the Anishinaabe stories that we talked about in our work and some of our writings has been about embodying truth as one of the 7 grandfather teachings, and describes this boy who goes on a vision quest and that he has to actually experience hunger, thirst, cold, loneliness in order to know the truth of those constructs. So just reading about them or talking about them or sharing stories about them are not the same thing as actually experientially learning, and that only when you experience it can you know something. And so this actually informs a lot of the way my lab does research. We try to follow the process of virtue development rather than just look at one time point. I think one example that was a study that looked at both kind of this experiential learning in our participants, but also our method reflected this approach, was a study conducted by Dr. Merve Balkaya-Inche, who was a postdoc in the lab, is now a professor at Wake Forest. We did work around the Ramadan, holy month of Ramadan in Muslim American adolescents. And we wanted to study how this time of fasting from sunrise to sunset from all food and drink, this incredibly spiritual time that has many relational rituals, how that would affect the development of patience and self-control and other character strengths. And so, one, we were focused on this highly experiential learning opportunity, but we also, in our methods, instead of just asking people, oh, before and after Ramadan, how patient are you? How much self-control do you have? We actually pinged them throughout their daily lives. So for 7 days before Ramadan began, 7 days during the fast, and 7 days a month after, we pinged them multiple times a day and asked what they were doing right then, who was with them, what was going on, and how much patience or self-control they were able to practice at that moment in time. And so there's a lot of results we could talk about in a different talk, but the short story is we found that these adolescents did grow in patience and self-control during Ramadan and sustained some of those growths in actually acting patiently and acting with self-control in their daily lives, even a month after. So I think it's a different approach to character research that's really important because it focuses on this process. And so in higher ed, I think it's important for us to think about not fixed traits or is this person a person of character or not, but instead of thinking of this as a lived developmental process that we enter into with our students, and we ourselves are on this growth trajectory as well. And so I think one thing to ask ourselves is what is a way students practice their character and what verbs could you use as you think about that instead of saying just how do they display it or who are they? Also, what do they do? So I'll turn it on to Janae.
Thank you. So I actually study something that's a little bit more popular than patience, which is gratitude. And I think it's fair to say that most people value gratitude. Most people think that it's a good thing and that we should have it. There are a few people who think otherwise, but most people are on board with this. However, despite the way that we value it, we highly value it, we still struggle with gratitude as a culture in America. It's something that we are not doing as well as we could. And maybe the reason why is because of the worldview that we have, the worldview that we've inherited from our Western culture. So I want us to think about how we might be able to learn from the Anishinaabe worldview to think about gratitude in a new way. So to do that, I want to start off by sharing a story because, as Anne said, and as we've done here today, we value story work as not only an important way of knowing, but a way of sharing what we know. If you can turn to the next slide. So I mentioned my grandpa at the very beginning, like I like to do. And my grandpa, when he passed away a couple of years ago, it was really quite hard on me because he actually raised me because I didn't have a dad in my home in my life. And so we were really close. And after he passed away, the summer after he passed away in the fall, I was out in my yard and I was weeding and I came across this patch here of wild strawberries growing in my front yard. Like I mentioned, our tribe is a woodland tribe, so strawberries are very special. They're called the heartberry. And we value these strawberries. And so when I saw this wild patch of strawberries, the meaning was not lost on me, especially after my grandpa had passed. It truly felt like a gift. And I was so grateful. They're little tiny strawberries. You can see they're like Skittles. They're completely different from the kinds that you can buy in the store. You can see how big those ones in the store are, right? And later on, after this experience happened, I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and maybe some of you guys have come across that book. I do recommend it, written by an Anishinaabe. In the book, she talks about strawberries as a way of understanding Anishinaabe worldview. And she compares store-bought strawberries to wild strawberries. And what store-bought strawberries teach us is a little bit about our consumerism and the way that we commodify the world and treat things like something that you can just pay for, transactional. Whereas wild strawberries teach us a little bit about gifts and about having transcendent indebtedness in the world. So indebtedness is actually a word that not a lot of people in America like. And I think that is precisely because it is countercultural. But I'm going to talk a little bit about indebtedness. So there are different kinds of indebtedness, just like there's different kinds of reciprocity. When I say reciprocity, I'm talking about this general desire to give back. And this is one of the Anishinaabe principles. But a transactional way of thinking about indebtedness or reciprocity has these features that you see things, the goods, the blessings as commodities or rewards. You can bypass the giver. So when we do gratitude practices, for example, we just do a list. We don't need to think about who gave it to us. We just write the stuff that we have, right? We also, when we think about reciprocity from this transactional perspective, we want equal repayment. So think about how absurd that would be, for example, with the strawberries. Like if I take strawberries from my strawberry bush, do I just give strawberries back to it? That's illogical. It doesn't make sense. But there is a way that I can repay it, right? And there's also, with this transactional perspective, there's an end. You want an end. You want to end the debt quickly. You want to get out of that. You don't even need a relationship. And if you have one, you want to end it quickly. The ongoing relationship is not necessary. But in this case, gratitude is really low or non-existent. So if we're doing reciprocity, if we're doing gratitude practices with this transactional way of viewing the world, then we are actually going to reduce the amount of gratitude that we feel. Okay, now transcendent is this type of relationship that we have with the wild strawberry bush. We see the good as a gift. It's not something we paid for, and there was no exchange. And in this case, I can recognize the giver. The creator gave me these flowers. This wasn't a chance thing. This was a gift from God to me to remember my grandpa. It's much more than a strawberry. And in this case, the repayment is going to be needs-based. So instead of putting strawberries back in the bush, I'm going to weed the bush. I'm going to water the bush. I'm giving the bush what it needs because I want to take care of the bush because I am now in relationship with the bush. And then what happens is a natural outpouring of gratitude. Gratitude is the outcome. So that's the difference between having a transactional approach to reciprocity and a transcendent approach. If you can go to the next slide, Anne. Okay, so hopefully, as I shared that story with you guys, you noticed a couple of things. First of all, I learned from a plant. A plant taught me. A plant cared for me. And ultimately, that plant reflected the creator to me. Okay, so how might we incorporate land-based character interventions? And I would like you to think in terms of not just taking your character interventions outside, but how can you learn from animals, plants, and the natural environment around you? So when individual gratitude is the focus for our youth, that's when we're more likely to have that transactional approach, and we may inadvertently encourage a what's in it for me mentality. And that's the opposite. That erodes gratitude. So you're scanning the world for all the things you have. You're scanning the world for all of your blessings. What do I have? What do I have? What's in it for me? When reciprocity is the focus, how can I give back? Gratitude is the natural outcome. So we might be thinking about that in a backwards way. We go to the last slide, just really quick. So to go back to my strawberry analogy, my strawberries had one more lesson to give me. The first summer that I had them, I wanted to eat all the strawberries. I didn't want a single one to waste. And I even when I was taking them from the bush, I would say, thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't want any of these to waste. I'm going to use all of them. And then something happened. The next year, my plant was a little bit smaller. My harvest was not as big. And then I realized I over-harvested my little strawberry bush. I didn't leave strawberries for the birds. I didn't leave them to fall into the ground and reseed and grow. I took everything for myself. This strawberry bush taught me that reciprocity isn't just about using everything that you have up and using it well, like Anne said, not wasting, but it's also keeping in mind the other people in relation with that strawberry bush. There were birds that were feeding on that. That bush needed to reseed to have generational impact. This strawberry bush taught me more than I could have learned in any other context. Hopefully that helps you guys understand a little bit of the Anishinaabe way.
I'm not going to actually I was thinking maybe I'll close with one more story, but I actually want to leave it, if it's okay with my co-presenters, leave it at that story. There are stories that are part of the 7 grandfather teachings to teach us about what we might think of as virtues of process, like Sarah was talking about, and of reciprocity, like Janae was talking about, truth, humility, respect, love, courage, honesty, and wisdom. And actually, unlike a lot of Western teachings about virtue, love is the thing that binds together instead of wisdom. Wisdom sometimes in certain Western traditions is the thing that is overall and sort of unifies, but in this tradition, love unifies, and love is symbolized by an eagle that has that 40,000-foot view and flies closest to the creator, and then can see future generations as well as like all different parts of creation, and what it means to live in harmony together. And so we would love to talk about these as ways of thinking about virtues that are in context with Anishinaabe people. But there might be other virtues that are relevant for your communities that we'd like to hear about in Q&A, and thinking about how to contextualize our work with students on this. So just thinking together about how to integrate stories in your teaching. We just invite you after this to maybe talk with your team about different stories from today and what they meant to you, and to maybe listen to each other and then notice how one story might carry multiple meanings and what that teaches you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Anne and Sarah and Janae, for the talk and for sharing this with us. I have a couple. I know that my internet went wonky right at the beginning, and so I want to make sure that we have a backup who's ready to go. And so Emily from our team is here, and she's ready to ask questions if necessary as well. We have time for Q&A, and so if you want to drop some questions in the chat, you're welcome to do so. Or if you want to raise your hand and ask the question in your own voice, we would appreciate that too. I want to hold space for someone else to ask a question first. I have a few as well that I might ask, but let me leave room for others to ask their questions first. Why don't I get us started? So I'm interested in a lot of things from what you said. I'm particularly interested in the weaving together you did with the story work, as well as the sort of traditional Western approaches to knowledge creation or thinking in that respect. And I want to sort of invite you to reflect a little bit more on the importance of weaving together of different knowledge traditions as part of our broader work.
I'll jump in really quick. One analogy that I like to use is the lens of a bee, and how a bee actually has several, or the eye of the bee, sorry, the bee has several lenses on their eye. And because they have hundreds of lenses, because of this, they have this 360-degree view, which is incredible. So they have this beautiful view of the world because they have these multiple lenses. And so I like to think about using story work, empiricism, whatever method that we use is just another lens. They're not in competition with each other, but they're creating a bigger picture. And story work from Anishinaabe is considered a valid way of knowing. It's a valid epistemology, not just valid, but it's the way of knowing. And but it's also very human. And Sarah can speak to this in a second after me. But we know that virtue is formed within stories and the narratives we tell about ourselves.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think many prominent virtue theories, including kind of one I've been a part of formulating, really do say that virtues are not just about the habits we have. So it does matter what we're doing, but it's not really a virtue until you are able to tie those habits to a narrative identity, a story of who you are and the community you're a part of that's bigger than yourself. That this must be transcendent to actually be a virtue. If it's only about me and my own productivity and actualization, it's not actually a character strength or virtue because it needs to be relationally moving outward. But we have to be able to tell that story. That's the psychological process that helps us make meaning of these things. I'll also say that I think in the academy, especially, we struggle with fighting over methods. We struggle even to do interdisciplinary work of science, collaborating with humanities and things of that sort. So I think this is just yet another kind of form of interdisciplinary, that there are multiple ways of building knowledge and learning, and that with a complex phenomenon like character development, we need to bring all of the ones we have at our disposal to actually understand and then promote character development in young people.
Anne, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Or I'll just give like my lens, my little B lens, from the philosophical perspective, which is that something that I'm learning through working with Janae and Sarah and working with people in other disciplines too, is about how, each kind of method of gaining more understanding has its own strengths that are sort of suited to what's out there that it investigates. And sometimes we can think that our method is like one method to rule them all or something. I mean, philosophers love to think this, by the way. We're like, oh, you got a doctor of philosophy in biology or whatever, right? So there's like a little bit of that tendency towards hegemony in my own discipline, which I will just confess. But just what I am learning in my own work and research is like what a limited perspective my own methodology brings, and where I have to learn from others because my method is not suited to certain like realities in the world. For instance, these like massive differences in context and in people and their personalities and their developmental stage. Like philosophy cannot tell you from the armchair what the differences are between a child and an adolescent, or when it does, it's like really just not accurate. So I think that helps me with the weaving. And that was like sort of a starting point for me to understand how we could like layer knowledge with things that look like they're competing.
That's great. There's a question in the chat that I wanted to voice, and then I see Jillian's hand. She'll be next. So Jane asks, I'm thinking about patience and process and how it fits into the 7 grandfather virtues. Is patience a manifestation of humility, of wisdom, of love, of courage?
Well, Janae, do you want to give kind of a perspective
You go
from
ahead, Sarah.
Well,
You're the patience expert.
we like to joke I'm one of the world's patience experts because so few people study it, at least scientifically. I think with patience, the context really does matter. And there's some different views on patience. Some people think about patience really related to kind of delay. The view I take is a little bit broader, that it relates to suffering. That's the Latin root for patience, and how we are receptive and how we receive things from the world, and especially things, whereas gratitude is how we receive good things, patience might be how we receive things we'd rather not have or have to wait for. And I think, right, that meta narrative someone has about what is good, why do bad things happen, is really going to inform their view of patience. And I think, I know from my personal Christian tradition, right, I think patience really is an expression of love, is how I personally most connect to that virtue, right? Love is patient is like a very famous Bible verse that everyone quotes at weddings. That if we're going to truly engage with other humans, we have to allow them the space and the time, and to be receptive to what they give us instead of demanding they be who we want them to be. But I think, again, this is going to really depend on the context we're in of how patients really acts. And I'm part of a large project right now that's looking at patients from diverse perspectives, and seeing some of those nuances contextualized, say, in Islam versus Christianity, or when dealing with disabilities or other forms of adversity in life. But Janae, I'm curious what you would say more from the Anishinaabe
Yeah,
perspective.
I would say an Anishinaabe knowledge holder would tell you to look to um, not to repeat myself here, but really to look to the land for an answer. The seasons do a really good job of teaching us patience, and that there's natural rhythms to life, and that, you know, whether or not you have patience, the seasons force you to wait. And there's actually a great story in Braiding Sweetgrass about a hunter who was, most people would not necessarily think that this man was very virtuous, but he wouldn't kill any of the babies of, I can't remember the species that he was hunting, because he knew that they would grow up and they would continue to uh, become a source for later. So he knew, like, I can't go after the babies. There's a patience in waiting. And she uses this story, and she's like, even somebody who's not very virtuous understands patience if they are working with the land and animals and just the natural cycles and seasons of things. So I think almost every question of character, there is an example within nature, within the land, within animals that they can teach us. They hold answers for us.
That's great. Jillian, would you like to raise your question?
Yeah, hi, my name is Jillian. I am a PhD student at Indiana University Bloomington in psychology and cognitive science. Sarah, we've chatted over Zoom before. This is a really cool, interesting presentation. In my work on morality, I try to make it really interdisciplinary. So part of that is this like secular, spiritual, or more transcendent way of looking at the world that's really hard to describe to people. Like they hear spiritual and they're just thinking religious or not religious. And so this has given me like a lot more vocab and different ways to talk about this with my research. But my question had to do with the differences. One of the differences between the models, the more transactional and the more relational, is that piece of reciprocity where it's more expected in the transactional model. But in the other model, there seems to still be some kind of expectation for reciprocity, right? Like you said, Janae, with the strawberries, like you felt like because you had taken so many of them, there weren't enough the next year. So is there still an expected reciprocity in that model as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just a different way of looking at reciprocity. So I think the reason why reciprocity can make us uncomfortable is because we go into that transactional mode, and then we think about, oh, I have to do this. So in my research I've done on indebtedness, we find that people want to repay. This transcendent indebtedness and reciprocity is like, I want to give back because I was given so much, versus I have to. So the transactional is a burden. The reason why it's a burden is because you're thinking about life as a closed system, like a jar that's closed. And then if you take stuff out, there's nothing more that goes in. So it's scarcity. And so it's whatever you put in, you have to take out, and it's this closed system. But a living system within reciprocity, it has to have give and take. There is no such thing as a free gift. Just like the rain cycles, for example, it is part of a living dance. And that's the definition of that, is that it's this going back and forth. That's how you know it's alive. Same with breathing in and out. That's a sign of life. So the fact that we separate giving from reciprocity, it actually is a dead version of relating. It's like, you don't have to do anything more. Just do this thing and then you're done. There's no more interacting, no more relating.
So to follow that up, Janae, I have one question that I think, and then I think we have one more in the chat. Your comment there about it's a dead version, right? So maybe the larger question here is like,
Yeah.
You started the conversation with contextualism. We're not aiming for the universal and we're not aiming for the relative, but I want to ask, what is the live, relatable, non-dead version of character education, right? What does that require of the universal or of all of us? Because I think there's a takeaway where we say, okay, that was good that was contextual.
Yeah.
But if there is a universal takeaway for those of us committed to this work, to the non-dead version of character, what is that? I mean, that's for everyone, but.
Yeah, I would say, what is a living organism? What are the components of something being alive, versus being an object, being something that just sits on a shelf and you can collect it and you can buy it, you can sell it, you can package it up and sell it like the strawberries, right? Versus something that's connected to a source, that's related, that's a part of a system. So I would want to see character education as part of a system, as somebody seeing themselves embedded within a system that is constantly moving. And then the part that is universal is the human components, right? The parts where we all have systems, we all need relationships. How that is enacted is going to be culturally specific. That's where the contextualism matters. So what does it look like to give and receive within a Western culture versus what does it look like to give and receive in a Japanese culture? It's going to be a little bit different, but the thing that ties it all together is that reciprocity is the process of maintaining relationship, and that is universal.
Yeah, that's great. Anne or Sarah, any
I'll
follow-up?
add too, I think one thing that's apparent is that college students are in general struggling right now. That this more transactional form of reciprocity, I think, is partly what is related to our loneliness crisis, to the high levels of mental illness symptomatology we're seeing, that helping them and helping ourselves to move beyond an economic kind of transactional model of I'm paying for a service, I receive. I know one story from some of our research collaborators ran kind of a religious study center for college students. And they said the college students kept feeling very uncomfortable and did not want free food because then they would feel that they owed something to this group and they did not want to be indebted to anyone. So I think even in small practices of giving and receiving of food, I mean, it can be lots of things, but talking about it and then examining ourselves, are we comfortable with being in relationality that's not tit for tat? And then how can we start to help construct our student spaces to move into that more relational model, I think is important.
Anne, did you want to add anything there?
I'll try to be super brief, but I think another related component, a very wise sociologist once told me that when society is ill, then individuals who are healthy are probably not, or something like that. That's a nod to Emily. And I think the symptomatology that Sarah and Janae are talking about in their work, and then Sarah's just mentioned, is something that should lead us to question whether our certain frameworks that we have are working. Like, is the model working? Is the model of individualism working? And so while we do want to allow for pluralism of thought and frameworks, we can start to contest certain frameworks. We're not claiming relativism, not every perspective is valid. And there's some reason to be worried about kind of individualistic frameworks that deny that all flourishing is mutual, and deny this kind of reciprocal living system model of flourishing, where the whole universe is entangled and our flourishing is dependent on the flourishing of other beings. So I would just say that's a place where I might push against the transactional model as well.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for this wonderful presentation. We're right at the hour, and I want to make sure I give you all your time back. For those of you who put questions in private comments to me, I'm going to keep track of those questions so I can send them to our webinar guests. But thank you so much, Janae, Anne, and Sarah, for your presentation. Thank you all for your presence with us today. We look forward to engaging with you all next month. And again, thank you.